a good bit about both of them, and many other personalists did as well. So Dostoevsky is famous for his notes from Underground, where the protagonist says, you know, rather than being kind of, and I'm paraphrasing, rather than a mechanistic view of human nature, humans are irrational. They would make bad choices just to show that we have free will. And he uses the analogy of, you know, being a person, not a piano key. So we're not just something that's played, we're something that has free will. So this existentialist conversation in the late 19th century and the early 20th century is another place where human free will and humanity in general rises to the center in this conflict between an ideal world, idealism, and a naturalistic worldview. Also in the 19th century, Pope Leo XIII is an important figure in several papal encyclicals. The first there talks about or encourages the re-embrace of Thomistic philosophy, Thomistic theology by the church. It doesn't say it so explicitly, but that's in the background of that encyclical. And then Rerum Novarum in 1891 is the beginning of, or the one of the foundational touchstones of Catholic social teaching, and it's emphasizes the need to find a middle ground between the individualistic capitalism, and collectivist communism, to find a middle ground between those two. And the word person is meant to communicate that middle ground. So it's not the atomistic individual. It's also not the individual who's so collectivized that it doesn't have its own free will. There's this middle ground, and personalists, that's why they choose that word person, because it's more than a material or biological individual, but it's not subsumed by the collective entity. And then the third encyclical, which was by Pius XI, Quadragesimo Anno, is a celebration of Rerum Novarum. So those are three encyclicals that inform personalist thought. Okay, let's talk about the second thing, that the new historiography of human rights doesn't emphasize enough, and that's that there was a changing view of what the state is. The concept of the state was in flux, it was in change. So when they say that personalists invented tradition when they embraced human rights, I think that's partially true, but it's partially an overstatement that doesn't take into account the historical context, the milieu, the crisis milieu of World War I, and then particularly the Great Depression in the 1930s, the global Great Depression, or mostly global Great Depression, and then, of course, World War II. So many people, including Christian personalists, including religious bodies, but many other people had a changing view of the role of the state, which included a changing view of the rights of the individual vis-a-vis or in front of or in relation to the state. So just a couple quick slides on that. This involved two main shifts. They're listed there. One is the shift from the state as a quote, night watchman. There's a quote on that, as a night watchman, as just a protector of security, to the state as more of a caretaker, providing for the needs and the welfare of individuals, particularly in this context, individuals who were suffering from unemployment, who didn't have enough food in the 1930s in the Great Depression. So that's one shift. And then the second shift is the foregrounding of the human person and the limiting of the sovereignty of the state. So if the first shift doesn't really say a lot about the sovereignty of the state, it could even mean the sovereignty of the state, the power of the state is stronger, maybe not. But the second shift is definitely a recognition of the limitations of state sovereignty, because the state had caused some states had caused so much devastation, not only to soldiers of other nations, but to civilians of their own nation and other nations, that the global community, for lack of a better term, or many elements of it, said we have to combat or limit not combat, we have to limit the sovereignty of the state. Among Christian personalists, two of the most prominent, my asterisk down here on this slide, Hocking and Meriton, wrote separate books entitled Man and the State. So they're writing about this evolution of the view of the state. The image on the right there is the National Recovery Administration in the United States, which is part of that first shift where the state starts to provide a lot of services and goods for individuals who are suffering from poverty and deprivation. An embodiment, sorry, there's a lot of text on this slide. I'll talk you through it quickly. An embodiment of this shift is in the preamble to the Covenant of the League of Nations in 1919 on the left, and the preamble of the UN Charter in 1945 on the right. And if you look at the bold language on the left, it talks about nations, governments, organized people, international cooperation. If you look at the bolded language on the right, it talks about peoples, mankind, fundamental human rights, dignity and worth of the human person, equal rights of men and women, social progress. So on the left, it's nations. On the right, it's more about people and human dignity. So that shows the evolution of the view of kind of the individual and the state to some degree. All right, where does personalism itself specifically fall into this discussion? I'm going to talk about it very briefly in general. That's one slide, and then show you a few personalists and what they said or what they thought. So as I mentioned earlier, personalists chose the word person over the word individual, and that has two main elements. There's two main reasons for that choice. You and I might think it's not that important a choice, but they meant two things by it. Number one, persons are spiritual, not merely biological or political or social. So this is the idea that there's something beyond the material natural world, and the natural world includes social relations and political relations, but there's something beyond that natural world that's metaphysical, that's spiritual, that is very important to the idea of the human being. Number two, persons are inherently relational. An individual could be just a material or biological element of the natural world in deterministic views. But the idea of the word person, personalists meant by that persons are inherently relational. We can't have a view of human beings as atomistic individuals disconnected largely from others. And that is a critique also of industrial capitalism, unfettered industrial capitalism that separated the individual from from others often. Okay, so ramifications of these two key elements of the person. Number one, and I've talked about this a little bit already, that personalism is a third way movement. It's not capitalist, it's not collectivist. It's trying to find a middle ground that has elements of both. Number two, personalism supports the inherent dignity and worth of the human person, right? If the human is spiritual, if the human has a core metaphysical element, whether that's Christian or Islamic or some other metaphysical root to it, that doesn't have to be religious necessarily. If that's true, then the human being, personalists argue, have an inherent dignity and worth. And therefore, the final ramification, human persons with both of these elements here, or with both of these two key elements above, as a ramification of those two, human persons have both rights and duties. That relational element brings in the duties, the spiritual element brings in the rights. Okay. William Ernest Hocking was a prominent personalist. He was a professor at Harvard. He wrote what some describe as the first exposition of human rights in the United States, the book that I have listed there, 1926. His view of human rights was state-centric. He was an idealist philosophically, and an idealist like Hegel and his followers often were quite autocratic. So he had some of that hierarchical autocratic view of human rights, but not because he was a reactionary, not because he was a conservative. He was more a liberal, but he was an idealist. So his view of human rights was more hierarchical. He only thought there was one essential human right, the right to self-development. And that could look different in different eras, because in different eras, the culture and the context would be different. So he argued that slavery was not necessarily wrong in its time because it wasn't known to be wrong. The culture had not evolved to the point. It was in the process of evolving to the point, but it had not evolved to the point of knowing that was wrong. He also advised Charles Malick on some of the drafting of the UDHR, a little bit, at least, and in particular, Article 1. Charles Malick was one of the personalists most involved in the drafting of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. He was Lebanese, Greek Orthodox. He was a Thomistic philosopher. He embraced natural law, the philosophy of, he embraced the philosophy of Thomas Aquinas, including natural law. In the United Nations, his work on human rights included being a prominent member of the drafting committee of the UDHR. He was also president of the Economic and Social Council, ECOSOC there, and he was chair of the UN Social, Humanitarian, and Cultural Affairs Committee. Both of those committees had to approve of the declaration before it got to the UN General Assembly. So he wrote it and was the president and then chair of two committees that had to approve it. So he was very intimately involved in it. He championed in particular freedom of the individual and intermediate institutions. So freedom of the individual is highlighted by Article 18, which talks about freedom of conscience, freedom of religion, freedom of belief. He said that if that article had not been adopted by the initial drafting committee, and there was some debate about it, he would have lost interest in the Declaration altogether, because that was the center for him. If humans don't have freedom of conscience, he believed there was no true freedom at all. They would be subject to the power and authority of the community or the state. He also argued passionately for intermediate institutions that exist between the individual or the human person and the state. So those institutions like family, religious congregation, collective work arrangements or unions, communities, those sorts of institutions. And so in Article 16.3, he was the champion that got the recognition of family as the fundamental unit of human society. I don't have the exact quote in front of me, but I think it was the fundamental group or unit of human society. So he was the one who championed that language in there, because he didn't want a situation where the state had power over the individual and could ignore the human family. He also helped to champion the idea that the parents have choice. Parents have the priority and choice of education for their children. So that's another example of championing the family. Jacques Maritain is one of the most prominent Catholic theologians and philosophers of the 20th century. He was a Thomist philosopher as well. He embraced natural law as well. He wrote the introduction to the UNESCO Philosophers Committee report. This was a report that compiled wisdom from voices all over the world, including Gandhi, including Aldous Huxley, and others, to try to get a pragmatic agreement on a list of human rights, even if they disagreed on religion, on philosophy, on metaphysics, to come up with a pragmatic agreement. He spoke prominently of the difference between natural law and positive law. He was a champion of natural law as an origin for human rights, whether religious or not, because he would point back to Greek philosophy that promoted natural law but did not have a religious basis for that. But he, of course, his basis for embracing natural law was Catholic and Thomistic. And he also argued for a pragmatic consensus, kind of like the Philosophers Committee, on human rights. So we can't agree on the underlying philosophical principles, but we can agree pragmatically, practically on what we should value as human rights. And he called that a democratic faith and also a democratic consensus. Emmanuel Mounier was the leading French personalist. He founded a magazine called Esprit that was kind of an intellectual literary magazine. He wrote a book called Personalism in 1936 that helped champion this movement. And he sought, whereas some of these others I've just mentioned were working on declarations and committees to codify the idea of human rights and to expound on the idea of human rights, he was more interested in a revolution. So he was highly critical of bourgeois Christianity. Mounier was a fan to a certain degree of Nietzsche. Mounier was very much an existentialist. So he sought a spiritual or moral revolution and thought that was more important than a declaration or declarations and legal codes. He also had a heavier focus on economic injustice, economic suffering, economic rights. So he had a high value for the Marxist critique of the modern era and of industrialism, of capitalism. So he was a leftist in this conversation here. And then last but not least, of my examples of Christian personalists who were attached to or associated with the development of human rights in some way or another is Dorothy Day. So Dorothy Day was a leader of the Catholic worker movement. She was the editor of the magazine, The Catholic Worker. She also wrote many articles for that magazine. She embraced Catholic social teaching, the principle of subsidiarity, that things should be handled as much as possible. Societal problems and challenges should be handled as much as possible at lower levels, not elevating them up to centralized, bureaucratic, higher levels of government, but handling them in the community as much as possible. She emphasized the Catholic idea of works of mercy. She was a deeply committed and invested servant, minister of the poor, the homeless, the hungry. She talked about, or she helped promote and operate many houses of hospitality where people, particularly during the decade of the 1930s and the Great Depression, where people who were struggling with homelessness, who didn't have work, who didn't have enough to eat, could come and support one another and be cared for. She also was a radical activist. So if on the one hand, she embraced Catholic social teaching, she learned a lot from Maritain and Mounier, and read their works. So if on the one hand she was in the line of Catholic social teaching, she was also very much a radical activist. So she promoted unions in an era when that was still somewhat radical and even dangerous to a certain extent. And she was a pacifist and a prominent advocate of disarmament. She said if the U.S. ever, in the middle of World War II, she said she was a pacifist and advocated pacifism. If a draft ever came for women, she would reject the draft. She advocated not paying taxes because so much of a person's taxes went to support the military industrial complex, although I don't know that she used the terminology industrial complex, but it went to support militarism. And so here on the left is just a picture of her a little bit earlier on, and on the right, the left kind of a normal picture, on the right, a picture of her pacifistic phase where she says, "He that taketh the sword shall perish," or quotes Jesus saying, "He that taketh the sword shall perish by the sword." So if you have in this personalist movement an idealist like Hawking, if you have two kind of theorists of natural law like Maritain and Mounier, Maritain and Malick, and then you also have more radical voices like Mounier and Day, you have a diverse movement here. And so that's important in this historiographical debate, because the new historiography gives, to this point, a kind of a monolithic picture of Christian personalism and its contribution to human rights. It doesn't see the nuance and the difference, and so it misses. As a result, it misses the kind of the diversity within the movement. All right, and then quickly let me talk about a few implications. So the personalist movement, the Christian personalist movement, has had a dramatic impact, even if we don't know it, on the 20th and 21st centuries. Pope John Paul II was a philosopher of Christian personalism. His dissertation research was in that space, and his ideas that helped him navigate the end of the Cold War and push for the end of the Soviet domination of the Soviet bloc and the ideas of collectivism, of extreme ideas of collectivism there. He was formed by personalism. Martin Luther King Jr. did his doctoral work at Boston University he also was a personalist. And so much of his approach to the problem of racism had personalist overtones to it. Then if you get to more modern times, or the more contemporary moment, the Sustainable Development Goals, for example, pull from or quote from or have as a touchstone the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And you have many NGOs that look to that, many transnational agreements and committees and things of that nature that look to the UDHR as a touchstone for and a motivator and a guider of their work. So that's some of the good. But then we could ask, what could we question about human rights, right? So what I've presented so far, not necessarily intentionally, but I think implicitly is a positive view of human rights. I don't mean of the idea of human rights. I don't mean to say it's all good. But I'm trying to describe how it came to be. So we could ask some questions. We could have some critiques of human rights. What might those be? On the very left there, there's a book about development buzzwords. Is human rights just a buzzword? Does it really do anything? And more negatively, more problematically, is it a word that powerful nations and powerful bodies use to control less powerful nations and less powerful bodies? Maybe. The middle book there, by another book by Samuel Moyn, talks about the inequality around the globe, and has human rights helped to distract from this, or helped in some ways to make this possible, the growing inequality in the world? Maybe. And then on the right there, the Organization of American States, that's Latin America, North America, Central America together. In 1948, they passed an American Declaration of the Rights and Duties of Man, based largely in Latin American philosophy and leadership and theology. And they talked about rights and duties. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights has very little to say about duties. It has something to say, but not much. So there's other elements there, in addition to rights, that we need to talk about, particularly duties. I have some possible next steps in my own research. Those would be, some examples would be comparing differences in the list of human rights of different people and what that might say about their view of human rights: more conservative, more progressive, more economically focused, more politically focused, more steeped in metaphysical ideas, more steeped in positivist or rationalist ideas, those sorts of things. Number two, we could compare, and I hope to compare, the impact of theology on views of universal declarations on human rights in this period. So theology of different people, there's lots of different theologies that have different implications for how human rights, people view human rights. And that's been under-researched in this new historiography of human rights. And then finally, I could research other pools, and I have done this some, but not published it yet, other pools of human rights language in the early 20th and in the 19th centuries, to see who else was using this language. There is some, and what that might say about human rights. So that's my discussion about human rights. Christian personalism is an important piece of it, and I hope this has been interesting to you. So thank you, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.
Thank you, Andy. And I think we have a few minutes, if that's okay, if there are any questions, to see if there are any questions from the audience. So you either can type a question in the chat box or in a Q&A box, or you can raise your hand and then we can unmute you and you can ask a question.
Great.
Mm-hmm. Maybe there's a question from Henrik as well.
I just have a comment, because I'm an economist and I speak about sustainability and goals of sustainability, and I see even in human rights, I understand you talk about the same too. You also mentioned goals of sustainable development.
Yeah, right. And I think inherent in the personalist view that, and it's not just personalism, right? It's others as well. But in the personalist view, or the view of those who say that rights are, that humans are relational, and that you have to have rights and duties, sustainability has a prominent place in that side of obligations and duties, right? We have rights and we have duties and obligations, not only in the space of sustainability, not only because of relations that exist right now, other people in the world, but because of future people, future generations, right? So the relational nature of personalist philosophy is one element that can support the idea of sustainability in the current generation and for future generations.
Yeah, so we all we all care about that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay, I see that there is a question or a comment. Can you please say a little more about what you mentioned briefly in the last slide about how the way human rights discourse has developed may have had a negative impact on those who are vulnerable? This was when you were mentioning the Samuel Moyn book, Not Enough.
Yeah, I mean, I think the basic critique there is that human rights discourse can at least distract from the problems of inequality in the world. So, the one of the big phenomena of the last several centuries, and particularly after World War II, is that the world has dramatically increased its productive capacity. Income, GDP per capita has dramatically increased. And that's brought a lot of good things, right? Material welfare, health, etc. But at the same time, of course, the problem with this increase has been this dramatically increased inequality as well. So some parts of the world have developed much more than other parts of the world. So the argument is that the focus on human rights, that discourse, can distract from the idea that this inequality has grown over time. So it can focus on specific elements of suffering or specific elements of racism or abuse without critiquing the structures of the global order that have either created or at least not minimized the growing inequality. So if human rights doesn't critique structures of power, if it focuses just on the rights of the individual, as important as those are, and they are important, but if it only focuses on that and it doesn't have a political critique of the structures of power, like the United Nations, like the dominant countries in the world, like the kind of exploitative capitalism that extracts mineral resources from places. If it doesn't critique that, it's not helping enough with inequality. And then a further, more radical critique could be, or is, that human rights can be exploited, that language can be exploited for all sorts of power, all sorts of ways that are really nakedly about power, right? That just this thin veil of human rights could be used to, control a country. And when you control a country, like if I mean, some people would, so why is the US or other global powers, why are they so interested in human rights in the Middle East? Does that not have a lot to do with oil, right? So if the language of human rights is a veneer to cover for the importance of protecting supplies of oil, then you've got a really problematic use of human rights. I wish that's not my area of research exactly. But those are some general comments on it.
Thank you for the answer. Do we have any other questions? That was a great question.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. All right. Well, as the last thing, just I wanted to mention that if you have any questions, please contact us at admission@lcc.lt. If you have any questions about our next series of webinar in maybe next academic year, so this session was the last one, so we will go for summer vacation. And then we hope that we will stay in touch and that you will join us next academic year in fall. But we still have our MA in International Management applications open. We have extended an application until June 1st. So if you are considering applying to LCC to our MA program, you are encouraged to do that. You're more than welcome to apply. If there are any questions, contact us at admission@lcc.lt or visit our website, lcc.lt. So thank you all for joining us today. Thank you, Andy, for giving presentation. Thank you, Henrika, for joining us tonight. And someone is asking, can study abroad students take classes with Dr. Williams?
Study abroad classes.
Yes. Well, I mean, probably students who are studying abroad at LCC.
Yeah, absolutely. I've had really good interactions with study abroad students in classes. I love it. They bring a lot to the table, and we have such an international student body that it's just a really great atmosphere to bring students from other universities in and have a good time together, learning together. So absolutely.
Okay, so Liz, you are also encouraged to join our study abroad program and visit and come LCC in fall or next semester in spring and take Andy's classes. All right, wonderful. Okay, thank you all. So we won't take much of your time, and Andy, I know that you have travel plans, so thank you for joining us. Have everyone a nice summer. And again, if you have questions, keep in touch with us and we will be able to help you out. Have a great evening and have a great day, Andy.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.